I remember the exact moment I realized the most dangerous man I'd ever met was completely helpless. It wasn't during a business negotiation. It wasn't when his rivals tried to take his territory. It wasn't even when fire consumed his wife and nearly took his son. It was when he held a 3-month-old baby boy in his massive, scarred hands and whispered the words that would haunt him for months. I don't know how to save you, but I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to where this story really begins, 6 months before that moment, in the ashes of what should have been Dominic Moretti's perfect life. The Brooklyn brownstone, burned for 4 hours before the firefighters could contain it. By the time the flames died, Dominic Moretti had lost everything that mattered. Almost. His wife, Elena, was gone. The doctors said she'd inhaled too much smoke trying to reach the nursery. She'd fought with everything she had, but the fire had been too fast, too hot, too merciless. The baby, their 3-month-old son Leonardo, survived only because Elena had wrapped him in wet blankets and placed him in the bathtub before she collapsed. A firefighter found him there, crying but alive, while his mother's body lay 10 feet away in the hallway. Dominic Moretti, the man they called the Wolf in certain circles of New York's underworld, stood outside that burning building watching his entire world turn to ash. Men twice his size had learned to fear his name. Federal investigators had spent years trying to pin something, anything, on his operation. Rival families whispered about him in the same breath they crossed themselves. But none of that power, none of that fear, none of that control could save the woman he loved. The fire marshal's report came back 3 days later. Faulty wiring in the walls, decades old, undetectable until it was too late. An accident, a tragedy, an act of God or fate, or whatever cruel force decides these things. But for Dominic, it was the end of everything, and the beginning of something he never saw coming. The fortress 3 months after the fire, Dominic's new penthouse in Manhattan looked more like a fortress than a home. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered views of Central Park, but heavy curtains kept them constantly covered. State-of-the-art security systems monitored every entrance. Armed guards rotated shifts outside the elevator. The place had cost $8 million, but it felt like a prison. And somewhere in the pristine nursery he'd had custom-built, Leo cried. He'd been crying for 6 hours straight. Dominic stood in the doorway of that nursery, still wearing his suit from the afternoon's meeting, his tie loosened, his expensive shoes kicked off somewhere down the hall. His dark hair was disheveled from running his hands through it. His jaw, usually clean-shaven and sharp, showed 3 days of stubble. His brown eyes, which had made grown men confess to crimes they didn't commit, were bloodshot from exhaustion. The baby, his son, lay in a crib that cost more than most people's cars, surrounded by toys and gadgets and every possible thing money could buy. Except the one thing he needed, his mother. Boss. Marco appeared behind him, Dominic's second-in-command and closest thing to a friend he had in this world. The agency sent someone else. 5th one this week. Tell them to leave. She's already here. I don't care. Boss, you haven't slept in 3 days. The kid won't eat. You've got the Castellano meeting tomorrow, and you look like hell. At least talk to her. Dominic's hands clenched into fists. Every instinct screamed at him to send this person away, to handle this himself, to not show weakness by admitting he couldn't take care of his own son. But Leo's cries cut through every defense he'd ever built. 5 minutes, Dominic said. Then she leaves like all the others. He had no idea those 5 minutes would change everything. The woman who didn't flinch, her name was Grace Harper, and she was absolutely nothing like the others. The previous nannies had arrived with credentials from prestigious agencies, recommendations from wealthy families, resumes filled with years of experience with high-profile clients. They'd taken one look at the security detail, the obvious wealth, the barely concealed violence that clung to Dominic like expensive cologne, and they'd found reasons to leave. One made it 3 hours before claiming a family emergency. Another lasted until she overheard a phone conversation about the shipment and taking care of the problem. The third actually called the police, though Marco had smoothed that over with impressive efficiency. But Grace Harper walked into that penthouse wearing jeans and a simple blue sweater, carrying a worn backpack, and didn't flinch when she saw the guard stationed outside the nursery. She was maybe 26, with auburn hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and green eyes that held something Dominic hadn't seen in months. Determination without judgment. Mr. Moretti? She extended her hand. Her grip was firm, her hands slightly calloused. I'm Grace Harper. I understand you're having trouble with your son. That's one way to put it. Dominic didn't take her hand. You know who I am? What I do. I know what people say you do. Her eyes met his directly. I also know you have a 6-month-old baby who's been crying for 6 hours, which means he's either sick, scared, or both. And I know that every fancy nanny with fancy credentials has walked out on you, which tells me they cared more about their reputation than about that baby. Something flickered in Dominic's chest. Surprise, maybe, or hope he was too afraid to name. You're not afraid? Grace's lips curved in the smallest smile. Mr. Moretti, I spent 2 years in the Peace Corps in West Africa teaching in villages without electricity or running water. I've delivered babies by flashlight, negotiated with warlords over school supplies, and once talked down a man with a machete who thought I was stealing his goat. Your security detail and your reputation don't scare me. Behind them, Leo's cries intensified. And that baby, Grace continued, her voice softening, doesn't care what his father does for a living. He just needs someone who won't give up on him. Dominic stared at this strange, fearless woman who'd just compared his security to a goat thief, and for the first time since the fire, he felt something other than grief and rage. He felt curious. He won't eat, Dominic said quietly. Won't sleep. The pediatrician says he's healthy, but he just won't stop crying. May I? Dominic stepped aside. Grace walked into the nursery like she owned it, moving directly to the crib where Leo thrashed and wailed. She didn't hesitate, didn't ask permission, just reached down and lifted him with the practiced confidence of someone who'd held 1,000 babies before. Hey, sweet boy, she murmured, cradling him against her chest. I know it's hard. I know you miss her. And just like that, Leo's cries began to quiet. Dominic stood frozen in the doorway, watching this stranger do what he'd been unable to accomplish in 3 months, bring his son peace. How his voice cracked. He cleared his throat and tried again. How did you do that? Grace swayed gently, humming something soft and wordless. He can feel your fear, she said simply. Every time you hold him, you're terrified you're going to break him or fail him or let him down. He feels that. Babies always do. The observation cut deeper than any knife Dominic had ever held. What if I do? The question escaped before he could stop it. What if I fail him? Grace looked up, and in her green eyes, he saw something that nearly broke him. Understanding. Then you get up and try again, she said. That's what parents do. That's what love is. Not never falling, but never staying down. In that moment, standing in a nursery filled with the ghosts of his failures, Dominic Moretti made a decision that would alter the course of his life. You're hired, he said. Whatever it takes to keep you here, whatever you need, it's yours. Grace studied him for a long moment, still holding his now quiet son. I don't need money, Mr. Moretti. I need your word that you won't give up on him. Or yourself. You have it. Then we have a deal. As she turned back to Leo, continuing her soft humming, Dominic felt something he hadn't felt since before the fire. Hope. He didn't know it yet, but the woman cradling his son had just become the most dangerous person in his life. Not because she threatened him, but because she made him want to be someone he'd never been before, the man he'd always pretended to be for Elena. And this time, he couldn't afford to fail. The first weeks, Grace Harper's first weeks in the Moretti penthouse, were an education in contrasts. The place was a fortress designed to keep the world out, but inside, it was falling apart. Dominic had money, more money than Grace had ever seen, but he was emotionally bankrupt. He conducted business from his home office, speaking in code on encrypted phones, signing documents that probably contained things she was better off not understanding. Men in expensive suits came and went at odd hours. Marco, the mountain of muscle who served as both bodyguard and right hand, seemed to live in the apartment more than his own home. But when Dominic emerged from that office and walked upstairs to the nursery, everything changed. His shoulders would drop. His hard expression would soften. His hands, which had probably broken bones and worse, would shake slightly as he reached for his son. How is he? Became his greeting every time. He's perfect, became Grace's standard answer. And slowly, imperceptibly, it was becoming true. Under Grace's care, Leo began to thrive. She established routines, feeding schedules, nap times, bath rituals. She sang to him in the mornings and read to him at night. She taught Dominic how to hold the bottle at the right angle, how to burp him without panic, how to recognize the difference between hungry cries and tired cries and scared cries. You're a natural, Grace told Dominic one evening as he successfully put Leo down for sleep. I'm terrified, Dominic admitted. They were standing in the nursery's dim light. both watching Leo's small chest rise and fall. Grace could smell Dominic's cologne, something expensive and masculine that probably cost more than her monthly salary. Good, Grace said softly. Means you care. The fathers who aren't terrified are the ones you have to worry about. Dominic's jaw tightened. Elena used to say something similar. She said fear for your child means love. That the day I stopped being afraid was the day I stopped caring. It was the first time Grace had heard him say his wife's name. She sounds wise. She was everything. His voice was rough, weighted with grief. Beautiful, kind, patient. She saw something in me that probably wasn't really there. Some version of me I wanted to be, but never quite managed. Grace turned to face him fully. In the low light, she could see the exhaustion etched in every line of his face, the burden he carried in the set of his shoulders. What if she just saw who you really were underneath everything else? Grace asked quietly. Then she was an optimist. Or maybe she just had better vision than you do. Something flickered across Dominic's face. Surprise, or maybe pain, or maybe something that looked dangerously like hope. Why did you really take this job? He asked suddenly. The Peace Corps, the credentials, the confidence. You could work for any family in the city. Safer families. Legal families. Why here? Grace was quiet for a moment, measuring her words. Because everyone deserves someone who won't run, she said finally. And because that baby in there doesn't care what his father's done. He just needs his father to be there. What about what I might do? I guess we'll find out, won't we? The words hung between them, heavy with implication. Before Dominic could respond, his phone buzzed. He glanced at it, and Grace watched his entire demeanor change, hardening, sharpening, becoming the man called the Wolf. I have to take this, he said, already moving toward the door. Will you be back tonight? Dominic paused in the doorway, silhouetted against the hall light. I don't know. There's a situation that needs handling. Grace didn't ask what kind of situation. She was learning that in Dominic's world, situations were usually the kind that made the morning news. Be safe, she said instead. He turned back, and for just a moment, his hard expression softened. Why do you care? Because Leo needs his father. And maybe, she trailed off, unsure how to finish the thought. Maybe what? Maybe you need someone who cares. The words landed like a physical blow. Grace watched Dominic's throat work as he swallowed. Watched something vulnerable flash across his face before the armor slammed back into place. Lock the door after I leave, he said roughly. Don't open it for anyone but Marco or me. Then he was gone, disappearing into whatever darkness waited for him in the New York night. Grace stood alone in the nursery, listening to Leo's peaceful breathing, and wondered what she was really doing here. She'd told herself it was about the baby, about helping a motherless child, about not abandoning someone who needed her. But as she heard the elevator ding and imagined Dominic descending into his dangerous world, she realized the truth. She was beginning to care about him too. And in a man like Dominic Moretti's life, caring was the most dangerous thing you could do. The breaking point 3 weeks after Grace's arrival, everything shattered. It started with a phone call at 2 a.m. Grace woke to Leo crying and her cell phone buzzing simultaneously. The baby was easy, hungry, a quick bottle, back to sleep within 15 minutes. The phone call was harder to dismiss. Grace Harper. Yes. This is Dr. Reeves from NYU Langone. You're listed as emergency contact for Marcus Chun. Grace's blood turned to ice. Marcus was her younger brother, 23, brilliant, chaotic, and apparently now in the hospital. What happened? He was brought in 2 hours ago. Motorcycle accident. He's stable, but we need family here. He's asking for you. The world tilted. Grace stood in the dark nursery, Leo sleeping peacefully in her arms, her phone pressed to her ear, and felt her carefully constructed composure crumble. I'll be there as soon as I can. She hung up with shaking hands. Her little brother, the annoying, reckless, brilliant kid who'd followed her around since he could walk, was in a hospital bed asking for her. And she was here, in a stranger's penthouse, caring for a child that wasn't hers, working for a man who terrified and fascinated her in equal measure. Grace carefully placed Leo back in his crib, grabbed her phone, and did the only thing she could think of. She called Dominic. He answered on the second ring, his voice alert despite the hour. What's wrong? Is Leo okay? Leo's fine. Her voice broke. It's my brother. There's been an accident. I have to go to the hospital. Silence on the line, stretching long enough that Grace thought he might have hung up. Then, I'm coming home. Dominic, you don't have to. I'm 10 minutes away. Don't leave before I get there. The line went dead. Grace stood in the darkness, tears streaming down her face, and wondered how her life had become so complicated. A month ago, she'd been between jobs, couch surfing with friends, trying to figure out her next move. The nanny position had seemed like providence, good pay, room and board, a chance to help someone who genuinely needed it. She hadn't planned on caring. Hadn't planned on looking forward to Dominic's late-night visits to check on Leo, when his guard would drop and he'd speak softly about Elena and his fears and the man he wished he could become. Hadn't planned on noticing the way his hands would gentle when he held his son, or the way his voice would soften when he said Grace's name, or the way her heart would accelerate when she heard his key in the lock. Hadn't planned on any of this. The elevator dinged. Heavy footsteps in the hall. Then Dominic was there, still in his dark suit, hair slightly disheveled, eyes sharp despite the hour. Tell me what happened. Grace explained about Marcus, the accident, the hospital. As she spoke, Dominic's expression shifted from concern to determined. Marco will drive you, Dominic said when she finished. He'll stay with you for however long you need. I can't ask you to do that. You're not asking. I'm telling you. He stepped closer, and Grace caught his scent, cologne and night air, and something uniquely him. Your family needs you. Go. We'll be fine here. Dominic, you can't take care of Leo alone. Then I guess it's time I learned. The words hung between them, weighted with more meaning than their simple surface. Are you sure? Grace whispered. Dominic reached out, and for a moment, Grace thought he might touch her face. Instead, his hand dropped to his side. I've built an empire through violence and fear, he said quietly. I think I can handle one 6-month-old for a few hours. Go take care of your brother. Grace nodded, grabbed her jacket, and headed for the elevator. She was halfway to the door when Dominic's voice stopped her. Grace. She turned back. He stood in the hallway, this dangerous, complicated man who'd let her into his life, his home, his heart without either of them quite realizing it. Come back, he said simply. It wasn't a command. It was a plea. Always, Grace promised. Then she was gone, and Dominic stood alone in his fortress with his sleeping son and the terrifying realization that somewhere along the way, the nanny had become something far more dangerous than an employee. She'd become someone he couldn't lose. The truth in the darkness, Marcus was going to be fine. Grace sat in the hospital waiting room as dawn broke over Manhattan, exhausted and relieved and emotionally wrung out. Her brother had a broken leg, 3 cracked ribs, and a concussion, but he'd survive. The doctors were keeping him for observation, but the danger had passed. Marco had been a silent, comforting presence through the entire ordeal, bringing coffee, dealing with paperwork, making calls. He'd been respectful, professional, and protective without being intrusive. As they walked back to the car, Grace finally asked the question that had been nagging at her. How long have you known Dominic? Marco was quiet for a moment. 15 years. Since we were kids in Brooklyn, before he became the wolf. What was he like? Before? Different. Marco opened the car door for her. He was always smart, always protective, but he was softer, had dreams beyond the life. Then his father was killed, and Dominic had to choose. Let the family fall apart or step up. He stepped up. He became what he needed to be to survive. Marco's expression was unreadable, but Elena saw who he'd been underneath. She made him want to be that person again. Grace watched the city wake up through the car window. And now he's drowning again. Trying to be a father when he never had one worth learning from. Trying to run an empire while raising a son. Trying to honor Elena's memory while accepting she's gone. Marco glanced at her. Until you showed up. I'm just the nanny. No, Marco said firmly. You're not. And the sooner you both admit that, the easier this gets. The words settled over Grace like a weighted blanket, comforting and suffocating simultaneously. When they arrived back at the penthouse, Grace expected to find Dominic frazzled, Leo crying, chaos reigning. Instead, she found them both asleep. Dominic was in the nursery rocking chair, still in his suit pants and white dress shirt, now rumpled and stained with what looked like baby formula. Leo was curled against his father's chest, both breathing in perfect sync. Grace stood in the doorway, her heart doing something complicated and wonderful and terrifying. This was the man they called the Wolf. The man federal investigators couldn't touch. The man whose name made grown criminals nervous. And he was sleeping with dried spit up on his shoulder, and his son clutched protectively against his chest. Grace pulled out her phone and took a photo. Not to share, just to remember this moment when Dominic's guard was completely down. As if sensing her presence, Dominic's eyes fluttered open. For a second, he looked confused, then aware, then almost embarrassed. "Hey," he whispered, careful not to wake Leo. "Hey," Grace whispered back. "You survived." "Barely." He cried for an hour. "I tried everything. Then I just held him and told him stories about his mother. And eventually, we both passed out." Grace moved closer, crouching beside the chair so she was eye level with Dominic. "What kind of stories?" "How we met. How she refused to date me for 6 months because she knew what I was. How she finally said yes because I showed up at her apartment every night for a week with dinner and wouldn't leave until she ate." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "How she made me promise that if anything happened to her, I'd be the father she knew I could be." "You're keeping that promise." "Am I?" Dominic's eyes met hers, vulnerable in the dim light. "Because most days I feel like I'm failing them both." "You're not." "How do you know?" "Because you're here. Because you tried. Because you didn't give up." Grace reached out and gently touched his hand where it rested protectively on Leo's back. "That's what being a father is. Showing up even when you're terrified, loving even when you don't know how, staying even when it's easier to run." Dominic stared at her hand on his, and something shifted in his expression. "Your brother, is he okay?" "He'll be fine. Stupid kid totaled his motorcycle, but he'll recover." "Good." Dominic turned his hand over, intertwining their fingers. The gesture was intimate, deliberate, world-altering. "Grace, I need to tell you something." Her heart hammered. "Okay. This life, what I do, it's dangerous. Not just for me, but for anyone close to me." Elena knew that when she married me, but she had family, protection, layers of insulation. His grip on her hand tightened. "You don't. If people find out you matter to me, to Leo, you become a target." "Are you firing me?" "No. God, no." He laughed without humor. "I'm trying to warn you. I'm trying to give you a chance to leave before this gets more complicated than it already is." Grace studied their intertwined hands, his large and scarred, hers smaller but strong. "What if I don't want to leave?" "Then you need to understand what you're choosing. I understand that Leo needs stability. I understand that you need help. I understand that whatever this is between us." She gestured at their joined hands. "It's probably a terrible idea." "Probably. Definitely." Grace smiled. "But I'm staying anyway." Dominic's eyes searched hers, looking for doubt, for fear, for any sign that she didn't mean it. Finding none, he did something that shocked them both. He leaned forward and kissed her forehead, soft and reverent, while his son slept between them. "You're either very brave or very stupid," he murmured against her skin. "Can't I be both?" This time his laugh was genuine, and Grace felt the sound in her chest like sunlight breaking through clouds. "We should get some sleep," Dominic said reluctantly. "You should move to an actual bed. That chair will destroy your back." "Can't. Every time I try to move him, he wakes up." Grace stood and held out her arms. "Give him to me. Go to bed. I've got this." For a moment, she thought Dominic might argue. Then he carefully, slowly transferred Leo to her arms. The baby stirred but didn't wake, settling against Grace's chest as naturally as he had against his father's. Dominic stood, stretching his tall frame, his shirt riding up enough that Grace caught a glimpse of defined abs and what looked like an old scar along his ribs. "Grace. Yeah. Thank you. For staying. For caring. For," he trailed off, searching for words. "For being someone I can trust. Always," she said, echoing her promise from earlier. After Dominic left, Grace settled into the rocking chair, holding Leo, watching the city wake up through the window. She knew she was falling for him. Knew it was complicated and dangerous and probably doomed from the start. Knew that his world and hers were incompatible in every rational way. But as Leo sighed contentedly against her chest, and she thought about the man sleeping down the hall, the man who'd cried over his wife, who'd driven through the night for her brother, who'd held his son and told stories about love, she realized something important. Some things are worth the risk. Some people are worth fighting for. And Dominic Moretti, for all his darkness and danger and deadly reputation, was becoming one of them. The attack 2 months after Grace arrived, Dominic's carefully controlled world exploded. It started with a meeting that went wrong. Dominic had been transitioning the organization toward more legitimate operations, real estate, investment, private security contracting. It was slow work, extracting himself from decades of illegal entanglements. But he'd promised Grace he'd try. He'd promised himself he'd build something Leo could inherit without shame. But not everyone in the organization agreed with this new direction. Vincent Castellano, one of Dominic's oldest associates, had been vocal about his opposition. "We're not venture capitalists," he'd snarled during one contentious meeting. "We're wolves. You go soft, someone takes your throat." Dominic had handled the dissent with his usual calculated control. What he hadn't anticipated was Vincent deciding to force the issue. Grace was giving Leo his afternoon bottle when the penthouse alarms started screaming. Within seconds, Marco burst through the door, weapon drawn. "Grace, take Leo and go to the safe room. Now." "What's happening?" "Just go." Grace's training kicked in, not nanny training, but the survival instincts she'd honed in West Africa. She scooped up Leo, grabbed the emergency bag she'd secretly prepared weeks ago, and ran. The safe room was hidden behind a bookshelf in Dominic's study. Marco had shown her the location her first week, but swore her to secrecy. Now she punched in the code with shaking hands, slipped inside, and locked the reinforced door behind her. The room was small but well-stocked. Water, supplies, monitors showing every camera feed in the building. On those screens, Grace watched her worst nightmare unfold. 4 men in suits had breached the building's lobby. They moved with military precision, overwhelming the security desk. She recognized Vincent Castellano from photos she'd seen in Dominic's office. Where was Dominic? She scanned the camera feeds frantically until she found him. In the parking garage, pinned down behind a car, exchanging gunfire with 2 more men. Grace's hands shook as she held Leo, who was miraculously still sleeping despite the chaos. This was his world. This was what she'd signed up for. This was the reality of caring about a man called the Wolf. On the monitor, she watched Dominic move with lethal efficiency. A man who struggled to warm a bottle transformed into someone terrifying and graceful. He dropped one attacker with 2 precise shots, used the moment of confusion to close distance on the second, and disarmed him with brutal hand-to-hand combat. She shouldn't be aroused by violence. She shouldn't watch this dangerous man eliminate threats and feel anything but horror. But as Dominic fought his way toward the elevator, toward her, toward Leo, toward his family, Grace felt something primal and undeniable. He was protecting them. This was who he was underneath the suits and the gentle touches. This was the Wolf. And she wasn't afraid. 15 agonizing minutes later, the penthouse door burst open. Grace watched on the monitor as Dominic entered, flanked by Marco and 3 other men. He was bleeding from a cut on his temple, his shirt torn, his knuckles raw. "Grace!" His voice echoed through the penthouse, desperate and commanding. She unlocked the safe room and emerged with Leo. The moment Dominic saw them, his entire body seemed to collapse inward with relief. He crossed the room in 3 strides and pulled them both into his arms, holding them so tightly Grace could barely breathe. "Are you hurt?" he demanded, pulling back to look at her face, her arms, checking for injuries. "We're fine. You're the one bleeding." "It's nothing." He touched Leo's head with infinite gentleness, the same hand that had just killed to protect them. He didn't wake up? Slept through the whole thing. Lucky kid. Dominic's laugh was broken. "Grace, I'm sorry. I'm so goddamn sorry. Don't. You could have been killed. You and Leo. Because of me. Because of what I—" Grace pressed her fingers to his lips, silencing him. Around them, Marco and the security team discreetly withdrew to give them privacy. "Listen to me," Grace said firmly. "I knew what this was. I knew the risks. I chose to stay. You shouldn't have had to choose this. Maybe not. But I did. And I'm still here." She took his face in her hands, forcing him to meet her eyes. "I'm not afraid of you, Dominic. I'm not afraid of your past, or your world, or the danger. I'm only afraid of one thing." "What?" "That you'll push me away because you think I can't handle it." Dominic stared at her, blood on his temple, death on his hands, his son sleeping peacefully between them. "How are you real? I ask myself the same thing about you." Grace smiled. "Now sit down before you fall down. You need stitches." An hour later, after the medic had patched Dominic's wounds and the cleanup crew had vanished all evidence of the day's violence, Grace found him standing in the nursery, watching Leo sleep. "Vincent?" she asked quietly. "Gone. Marco handled it." Dominic's voice was flat, empty. "He won't be a problem anymore." Grace didn't ask what that meant. She already knew. "What happens now?" "Now I accelerate the transition. No more half measures. No more patience." He turned to face her, and his eyes were hard with determination. "I'm getting us out, Grace. All of us. Whatever it takes." "How long?" 6 months. Maybe a year. I have enough legitimate operations that I can sell off the rest, pay the right people, extract myself cleanly. Will they let you? They won't have a choice. Grace moved to stand beside him, both of them watching the gentle rise and fall of Leo's chest. Can I ask you something? Anything. Why now? Why transition now after all these years? Dominic was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. Because Elena asked me to. Before she died, she made me promise I'd build something clean for our son. Something he wouldn't have to be ashamed of. He turned to face Grace fully. But I didn't have the strength to actually do it until you showed up. Me? You? He cupped her face in his hands. You look at me like I'm someone worth saving. You stayed when anyone rational would run. You care about my son like he's yours. You make me want to be the man you see when you look at me, instead of the man I've been. Grace's heart thundered against her ribs. Dominic, I'm in love with you. The words fell between them like grenades. I know it's too soon. I know it's complicated. I know Elena's only been gone 6 months, and I should be grieving instead of feeling anything else. But I can't help it. I love you, Grace Harper. And if you'll have me, have us. I swear I'll spend the rest of my life becoming worthy of you. For a moment, Grace couldn't speak, couldn't breathe, couldn't think past the roaring in her ears and the absolute certainty flooding her chest. You already are worthy, she whispered. You always were. You just needed someone to remind you. Then she kissed him. It was soft and desperate and tasted like hope and second chances. Dominic's arms wrapped around her, pulling her close, and Grace felt like she was finally home. When they broke apart, both breathing hard, Dominic rested his forehead against hers. Move in with us, he said. Not as the nanny. As family. As my partner. As Leo's. He swallowed hard. Elena's gone, and I'll always love her, but Leo needs a mother, Grace. And I need you. Will you stay? Really stay? Grace thought about her cramped apartment, her uncertain future, the life she'd been building before she walked into this beautiful, dangerous world. Then she thought about Leo's smile, Dominic's rare laughter, the family they were building from broken pieces. Yes, she said simply. I'll stay. Outside, New York glittered with a million lights. Inside the fortress, a new family was being born, built on the ashes of tragedy, forged through danger, and held together by the kind of love that refused to give up. 18 months later, the headlines called it the business deal of the decade. Dominic Moretti had sold his entire operation, every territory, every asset, every connection, to a coalition of his former associates. The price was high enough that several news outlets speculated he'd become one of New York's wealthiest legitimate businessmen overnight. What the headlines didn't mention was the careful negotiation, the strategic alliances, the threats and counter-threats, the night that 3 rival families had tried one last time to stop the deal and found themselves facing the wolf at his most terrifying. Grace had watched from the sidelines as Dominic transformed himself. The transition had been brutal, months of tense meetings, close calls, late nights when he'd come home exhausted and dangerous. But he'd done it. Now, standing in the living room of their new house in Westchester, real house with a yard and trees and neighbors who had no idea who Dominic used to be, Grace watched her family and felt something she'd almost forgotten: peace. Leo was toddling around the room, his dark curls bouncing, babbling in the language of almost 2-year-olds. He lurched toward Dominic, who scooped him up effortlessly. Hey, buddy, you being good for mama? Leo nodded enthusiastically, then planted a wet kiss on Dominic's cheek. Mama. The word still made Grace's chest ache with joy. They'd gotten married 6 months ago in a quiet ceremony with Marco as best man and Grace's brother Marcus walking her down the aisle. Leo had been ring bearer, though mostly he'd just eaten the pillow. Dominic caught Grace's eye across the room and smiled. That devastating smile that still made her heart skip. What are you thinking about? He asked. How far we've come. Grace moved to join them, wrapping her arms around both of them. I was thinking about something, Dominic said, his voice suddenly serious. What? I want to change Leo's birth certificate. Add your name. Make it official. He shifted Leo to one hip so he could take Grace's hand. You've been his mother in every way that matters. I want the paperwork to reflect that. Tears pricked Grace's eyes. Are you sure? I've never been more sure of anything. Elena gave him life, and I'll make sure he grows up knowing her, loving her, honoring her. But you gave him a future, Grace. You saved us both. You're his mother now. Grace kissed him, tasting salt and joy and second chances. Mama. Leo demanded attention, pulling their faces apart with chubby hands. They both laughed, and Grace felt like her heart might burst from fullness. Later that night, after Leo was asleep, Grace and Dominic sat on their back porch, watching fireflies dance in the darkness. "Do you miss it?" Grace asked quietly. "The power, the reputation, the fear?" Dominic was quiet for a long moment. "Sometimes," he admitted. "Not the violence or the danger, but the clarity. In that world, you always knew where you stood, who your enemies were, what the rules were. And now I get up every morning, and I don't know if I'm doing this right. Being a father, being a husband, being normal." He took her hand. "But then I see Leo smile, or I watch you with him, or I come home to an actual family instead of an empire, and I realize I don't miss it at all. I just got used to being someone I didn't particularly like. And now I'm becoming someone I might actually respect." Grace squeezed his hand. "Elena would be proud of you." "Maybe." Dominic pulled her closer, and Grace settled against his chest. "But you're the one who made it possible. You're the one who stayed when I was drowning. You're the one who looked at a monster and saw a man worth saving. You were never a monster, Dominic. You were just lost. Then you're the one who brought me home." They sat in comfortable silence, listening to the night sounds of their safe, normal neighborhood. "Grace, thank you." She tilted her head to look at him. "For what?" "For answering that door. For not running. For loving us." His voice was rough with emotion. "For being brave enough to choose this life when you could have had something easier, safer, simpler." Grace kissed him softly. "This is exactly what I chose. You and Leo, and this beautiful, messy, complicated life we're building together. No regrets. Not a single one." As if on cue, Leo's cry echoed from upstairs. Not distressed, just awake and wanting company. Dominic started to stand, but Grace stopped him. "My turn. You get the next one." She headed inside, climbing the stairs to the nursery they'd decorated together. Leo stood in his crib, tears on his cheeks, arms reaching up. "Hey, sweet boy," Grace murmured, lifting him. "Bad dream." He buried his face in her neck, and Grace swayed gently, humming the same song she'd hummed that first night in the penthouse 18 months ago. "You're okay," she whispered. "Mama's here. Always." From the doorway, Dominic watched them, his heart so full it almost hurt. He'd built an empire through fear, lost a wife to tragedy, nearly drowned in grief and violence. But somehow, impossibly, miraculously, he'd found salvation in a woman who refused to give up on him. Grace caught his eye and smiled, and in that moment, Dominic understood something profound. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is let someone love you. Because once they do, you become someone worth being. And that, he realized, was the greatest redemption of all. Sometimes salvation doesn't look like you expect. Sometimes it looks like a woman with green eyes and a fearless heart who walks into your darkness and refuses to leave. Sometimes it looks like choosing love over power, family over reputation, redemption over resignation. Sometimes the most dangerous thing you can do is accept that you're worth saving. This is the story of how Dominic Moretti lost everything and found something better. This is the story of how Grace Harper saved a family by simply staying. This is the story of how a mafia boss became a father, a widower became a husband, and a woman's courage changed everything. Because in the end, love isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up when it's hard, staying when it's dangerous, believing when it seems impossible, and building something beautiful from the ashes of what was lost. That's what makes us human. That's what makes us whole. That's what makes us worth saving.